They called us war criminals, enemy scientists, monsters who built weapons for the worst regime in human history. But 6 months after Germany surrendered, I was sitting in an American military office in Ohio, being asked to do the exact same thing I did for Hitler, only this time for the United States Air Force. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what I helped create. In 1944, while the world was still fighting with propeller planes, we built something that changed warfare forever. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the first operational jet fighter in history. It was faster than anything the Allies had, more advanced than any aircraft on Earth. And when American pilots saw it screaming across the sky at over 500 miles per hour, they knew the future of flight had arrived. What they didn't know was that in just a few years, we would be building that future for them. Let me take you back to 1943. Germany was losing the war. Everyone knew it, even if we weren't allowed to say it out loud. Our cities were being bombed day and night. The Soviets were pushing from the east. The Americans and British were preparing to invade from the west. We were running out of fuel, supplies, soldiers. Everything was falling apart. But there was one place where Germany was still ahead. One area where we dominated the world, aviation technology. I worked at the Messerschmitt factory outside Munich. My job was to solve problems that seemed impossible. How do you make an aircraft fly faster than the speed of sound? How do you design engines that don't rip themselves apart from the heat and pressure? How do you create a weapon that can turn the tide of a war that's already lost? These weren't just engineering questions, they were survival questions. Because if we failed, if we couldn't deliver what the Luftwaffe demanded, we knew what would happen. The SS didn't tolerate failure. The Me 262 project started years earlier, back when Germany was still winning. The idea was simple, but revolutionary. Instead of using a propeller driven by a piston engine, we would use a jet engine, a turbine that sucked in air, compressed it, mixed it with fuel, and shot it out the back at incredible speed. The thrust would push the aircraft forward faster than any propeller ever could. On paper, it was brilliant. In reality, it was a nightmare to build. The engines overheated constantly. The turbine blades would melt or shatter after just a few hours of use. The fuel consumption was insane. The materials we needed were almost impossible to find because of the war shortages. And even when we got the engines to work, the airframe had its own problems. The swept wing design was unstable. The landing gear was too weak. The cockpit instruments couldn't keep up with the speed. Every time we solved one problem, 3 more appeared, but we kept working. 18-hour days, 7 days a week. We slept in the factory sometimes because going home meant wasting time. And slowly, painfully, we made progress. By early 1944, we had a working prototype. It was crude, it was dangerous, but it flew, and it flew fast. Faster than any Allied fighter, faster than anything they could throw at us. When the Me 262 entered combat in the summer of 1944, it was like watching magic. Allied bomber formations that had been untouchable suddenly became vulnerable. Their escort fighters couldn't catch us. Their gunners couldn't track us. We would dive in at 500 miles per hour, fire our 30mm cannons, and be gone before they even knew what hit them. For the first time in years, German pilots had an advantage, a real advantage, but it was too late. We didn't have enough jets, we didn't have enough fuel, we didn't have enough trained pilots, and we definitely didn't have enough time. By the spring of 1945, the war was over. The factories were destroyed. The runways were bombed. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had collapsed in 12. And suddenly, all of us engineers who had been considered essential, who had been protected from the draft, who had been given extra rations and privileges, we were just unemployed scientists in a destroyed country with a very dangerous skill set. I'll never forget the day the Americans arrived at our facility. It was late April 1945. We had already burned most of the documents, destroyed the prototypes we couldn't hide. We knew what happened to people who worked on secret weapons projects. We expected to be arrested, maybe executed. At best, we thought we'd spend years in a prisoner of war camp and then be left to starve in whatever was left of Germany. But that's not what happened. The American soldiers who showed up weren't regular infantry. They were technical intelligence officers, specialists. They came with lists, names, addresses. They knew exactly who we were and what we had worked on. And instead of arresting us, they started asking questions, very specific questions. How did the turbine blades handle stress? What alloys did we use? What were the thrust-to-weight ratios? How did we solve the combustion instability? At first, we didn't understand what was happening. Then one of the officers said something I'll never forget. He said, "The war with Germany is over, but there's another war coming, and we need people who know how to build jets. They weren't talking about Japan. Japan was finished too, even if they didn't know it yet. They were talking about the Soviet Union, about Stalin, about the fact that the alliance between America and the Soviets was already fracturing, about the reality that in a few years, maybe even a few months, the Cold War would begin. And when it did, whoever had the best aircraft, the best missiles, the best technology would have the advantage. The Americans had a problem. They were far behind in jet technology. The British had the Gloucester Meteor, which was decent but not revolutionary. The Americans had experimental jets, but nothing combat ready. Nothing that could match what we had built. And they knew that the Soviets were thinking the same thing. Soviet troops were already in Eastern Germany, rounding up scientists, seizing equipment, taking entire factories apart, and shipping them back to Russia. It was a race. A race to capture German technology before the other side got it. That's when I first heard the name Operation Paperclip. It was a secret program, highly classified. The idea was to identify German scientists and engineers who had worked on advanced weapons, bring them to the United States, give them new identities, and put them to work for the American military. The problem was that many of us had been Nazi Party members. Some had worked directly with the SS. Some had used concentration camp labor in the factories. Legally, we should have been prosecuted as war criminals. Morally, we probably should have been. But the Americans made a choice. They decided that our knowledge was more valuable than justice. So they created false documents. They erased our Nazi Party memberships from the records. They wrote reports that downplayed or ignored our connections to the regime. And they clipped those reports to our files with paperclips, which is supposedly where the operation got its name. Then they shipped us to America. I was put on a military transport plane with about 30 other engineers and scientists. None of us knew where we were going. None of us knew what would happen to our families. We just knew that we had been given a choice: work for the Americans or take our chances in occupied Germany. It wasn't really a choice. We landed at an airbase in Texas. From there, we were split up and sent to different locations. Some went to White Sands in New Mexico to work on rockets. Some went to Alabama. Some went to California. I was sent to Wright Field in Ohio, which was the center of American aviation research. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, they called it, the same place where the Wright brothers had tested their early planes decades before. Now it would be where we would help America build jets. The first few months were strange. We were technically civilians, but we lived on the base. We had handlers who watched us constantly. We weren't allowed to leave without permission. We weren't allowed to talk about our work. We were given English lessons, American customs lessons, lessons on how to act like we belonged here. But everyone knew we didn't belong. The American engineers looked at us with suspicion, sometimes anger. Their brothers and sons had died fighting Germany, and now we were colleagues. But once the work started, things changed. Engineers are engineers. We speak the same language, even if our native tongues are different. We all wanted to solve the same problems. We all wanted to push the boundaries of what was possible, and slowly, the walls came down. The Americans were smart, very smart, but they were years behind in certain areas. Their metallurgy wasn't advanced enough. Their understanding of high-speed aerodynamics was incomplete. Their engines were reliable but not powerful enough. They needed what we knew, and we needed them to give us a purpose, a reason to keep going, a way to avoid being sent back to a Germany that no longer existed. So we worked. We took everything we had learned building the Me-262 and we applied it to American aircraft. We helped design the engines for the F-86 Sabre, which became the dominant fighter of the Korean War. We contributed to the development of swept-wing designs that would define jet aircraft for decades. We shared our knowledge of transonic flight, of jet propulsion, of materials science. We helped America leapfrog a generation of aviation technology, and the strangest part, it worked. The same principles we used to build Hitler's jets became the foundation of American air superiority. The F-86 Sabre shot down Soviet MiGs over Korea using designs that came directly from our work in Germany. American pilots flew missions using technology that had once been aimed at destroying them. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. But there was something else we didn't talk about: guilt. I don't know if the Americans understood this, but for many of us, working on these projects wasn't just about survival or opportunity. It was about redemption. We couldn't undo what we had done. We couldn't bring back the people who died in the war. We couldn't erase the fact that we had worked for a genocidal regime. But maybe, just maybe, we could build something that mattered. something that protected people instead of destroying them. Maybe we could take the knowledge we gained in the darkest period of human history and use it for something better. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. None of us do. But I want you to understand the complexity of what happened. History isn't simple. People aren't simple. We weren't heroes, but we weren't just villains either. We were engineers who made a series of choices, some coerced, some calculated, some selfish, and those choices shaped the world you live in today. The jets you see flying overhead, the passenger planes that connect the world, the military aircraft that defend nations, they all trace their lineage back to those desperate days in Germany when we were trying to build something impossible. And then to those strange years in America when former enemies became reluctant allies in a new kind of war. By the 1950s, most of us had settled into our new lives. We became American citizens. We raised families. We published papers. We trained the next generation of aerospace engineers. Some of us became famous. Wernher von Braun, who built the V-2 rockets, became the face of the American space program. Others remained in the shadows, known only to specialists and historians. The technology transfer was complete. America had absorbed everything Germany knew about jets, rockets, and advanced aviation, and it paid off. The United States dominated the skies throughout the Cold War. The Soviet Union tried to keep up, and they captured plenty of German scientists too, but America got there first and went further. The air superiority that defined American military power for the next 70 years started with Operation Paperclip, started with us. Today, people debate whether it was worth it, whether bringing former Nazi scientists to America was a moral compromise that shouldn't have been made, whether justice was sacrificed for strategic advantage. I don't have an answer to that. I can only tell you what happened. I can tell you that the same hands that designed Hitler's jets also designed the aircraft that protected the free world during the Cold War. I can tell you that history is messy and complicated and full of people making impossible choices in impossible situations. The Me-262 was supposed to be Hitler's secret weapon, the aircraft that would turn the tide of the war. It failed, but the knowledge that created it didn't disappear. It migrated, it evolved. It became the foundation of modern aviation, and the engineers who built it, the ones who survived, who were captured, who were recruited, we became ghosts in the machine of American power. Our names were classified, our pasts were erased, but our work remained. Every time an American jet takes off, there's a small piece of that story in its design. A small piece of those desperate days in Germany. A small piece of the choices we made, the compromises we accepted, the knowledge we carried across the ocean. We helped build Hitler's Air Force, and then we helped build America's. And if you want more untold stories from the Cold War, check out the next video.